Mana sapaia, kuka amat iris. Sini mi arfa para masakın eni şeret. Saparat mania. Kiam eros sohros shat emera tukane me eresafte penera pekasanai. Si eni flipi shoro ka ere pukara baptimi eftimi ere shatakarame eras. Kakarama safti beni fere shokra satimian. Yadir sofara mashatakarabini mi erin sefera. Kukara, kukara, kukara. Kukara, kukara, kukara. Kukara, kukara. Kukara. Yamasanakare. Yamanesakare. Yamasana nakara emasharo eraksamatine. Sora mashefene masaketi erapokarati aramasane sharan. Soy, 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 soy. Paramo forma satefet soka. Sana maratene meshare. Kiara masanana. Kiara masanana. Koyara mashafat selene. Koyara manafereren sana. Kia. Kia sum pada coro tim biti tart shuf ani pach pach kia am so tere taka kukora papaman mashadi pifera psa amasa futara moko satin Siti meshoro fara masafane e shara takatsiam sadine ara mashara vaparam niefte pekara shatetre samafte pere shafte kera safte perana sakanine farosati shinini shoro farasafte koro kanesher. Yine meshat anlıyoruz safti bir şukunayı. Kiki nesifti pisato kadiri şofaren. Kakana fara pokuru pesati yaratıkoy. Ana şara sakamani. Ana şara sakamani. Yetiri sofamani şorok safiyepa. Kana nara faltara masafiye niyanasa. Paramat Shari Kara Sakani Shari Kiara Mufara Masana. Kotanda Nayipsha Kotinda Kota Sim Ipir Shufasa Tepikatini Anish Substikataman Turukot Sati Shukatane Fada Patamanero Satakarapasipi Ish Tukadem Ian Kup Artimin Tito Masatipano Kapirish Tukum Kid Init Olo Saporpatepe Anib Interish Kot Inisi Katara Sapot Inishit Et kufa takan imi et erish takanim eft besukut erata samokora kohanishit era sopokote ni arita potara patakamani kohst etien ummati torotakan er takamo sapoma ini shetera pokolin koteta mo erosh katim eneftin katin kukara tibit in Kotana na yuksha kotinda kota. 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 Kotanda na yipsha kotinda kota. Kotanda na yipsha kotinda kota. Samatakanit irpokosatira timishim sutarannakai apsuborakatsai. Koi, 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 koi. Napsera pufrasatinene shit eret sokonan ener. Shiara masafana katira safana. Shiparama fopa satetera sokonat in sharap supani. Ukaramashinena. Ukaramashinena. Kotanda nayipsha kotinda kotan. Kotanda nayipsha kotinda kotan. Kotanda nayipsha kotinda kotan. Kotanda nayipsha kotinda kotan. Pero pues, pero porque me te rechazo. من سفر من سفر وكان يشير تكتبر بكتب في تفهم السفر من سفر في تنمي في بدور الشتف تبدور بكت إيش تبين إيش تبرت تمن إيش تبسكت كأنا ما سفت بدين الشتف بربطك أي من سفت بين إنني أفتبر بكت إير تتمن إيش بين من أربطك ربطين من شفت بربط من ستة تقدر سفيش Farama Amia Afama Mama Pitemi Elfoporoma Seftipine Kara Seftimin Ene Urne Senimin Ene Min Sura Petakadet Ere Teka Ishu Fara Sefana Sik Imisife Asa Sekamuna Seb Eshet Ene Era Sufana Ama Ani Eshet Kotusoi Ama Ani Emi Alataftipa Koroi Shishara Safa Samukure Sefam Sim Yesefim in Soter Shafa Massimin Atera Pupoya Satiara Mush Timi en Sifti Pidir Putsam Timi Alamasufara Tetai Kari Satira Kana Masafara Masatanini Sharai Kiara Safa Mukara Sapini Shili Niru Karatati fepara safamusuti ukatatini eftipine no shana oi ya oi Ianeferet sanirusharam kukaratiaranan isharasanam tikanamara safare nishara tiamapana sarasani karanakai. Tanda yuksha kotinda kotai. Tanda yuksha kotinda kotai. Tanda yuksha kotinda kotai. Tanda yuksha kotinda kotai. Welcome to the September 8th, 2023 episode of Why Am I Like This? Thank you for being patient as I channeled in order to open and maintain these portals. I guess I'll say, as I say at the beginning of every episode, and sometimes at the end, the guarantee that I'm called to make with this container is that no contexts will be enmeshed within the space-time of this container, and context will be disenmeshed within the space-time of this container. Or another way of saying is that it is that no undue karma will be accumulated and karma will be ripened or resolved. Welcome you to disagree with me or to let me know here in text or in audio or anywhere else if you feel like the guarantee has been violated in some way. Or if anybody's watching this and you don't feel comfortable confronting me with an allegation of a violation of this guarantee, then feel free to talk shit about me behind my back. You would not be the first person. Anyway, I guess since I've spent almost half of this container channeling, I'll just like get to the questions which I felt guided to pick out today. The first one, which I'll answer, I guess, is called "What do you mean by lineages?" which was posed to me by somebody who goes by Singarius on Twitter or Nicotin Amiga. This is another one of those questions where I feel like I'm curious why I felt called to bring it into the container of why am I like this, and I didn't just like answer the question where it occurred, because in some ways it feels like a pretty simple question. And like the simple answer that sort of comes to mind for me is that a lineage is anything that propagates itself. But given that I brought it into this container and I didn't just like answer it in a sort of like glib or concise sense for Singarios. My sense is that like there's probably more to say about it, and there's probably more to say which will, as I've spoken about in the past, like set a context in which those who listen to it can bring their awareness into that context. And then my sense is that like some of the things which will come into awareness as that awareness fills the context of some of the things I'll say will be like representations of karma which are ready to be released, which is sort of the gentle way of saying it, or will reflect contexts which are enmeshed with the context in which awareness brings these things up in experience so they can be harmonized, which is like another kind of like euphemistic way to talk about it. But I'll say that like the way that my perspective sees the perspective of my lineage and articulates it or chooses to articulate it would be the way that I answer this question will probably bring demons into people's awareness, and that in the containment of Why Am I Like This September 8th, 2023, the necessary frequencies will be present in order to exercise these demons. So I'm very curious how I choose to answer this question. The second question I've been the second question I felt guided to choose for this container is, why is your birthday a complex topic? And that question was brought up for me by Maya Hadisto or Diamond D on Twitter. And part of the reason I feel like I was called to bring this question up is because tomorrow is my birthday. Well, you could say like tomorrow is the calendar date of my solar return, which is supposed to basically track the time of year, or like the time that the sun is going to be in the same part of the sky that it was in when I was born. But you know, the earth is wobbling, everything around us is slowly changing its position. So what does it mean for the same part of the sky to be occupied by the sun as it was when I was born? Um, and why is it a complex topic? Um, so yeah, I guess I'll start with that topic, kind of surprisingly. I'm not sure when I'll come back to the first topic. If you all have tuned into Why Am I Like This before, you're probably aware that it's a very non-linear container. So I hope that you'll continue to bear with me. Um, so in the previous episode of Why Am I Like This, I spoke about terma. I think it was the first episode of Why Am I Like This. And if I remember correctly, I spoke about how terma reflects accumulation of, I would say, like particular textures of awareness in particular contexts of space and time, and the accumulation of awareness around these contexts, such that terma could be said to represent shapes or yeah, like forms in the material of different realms of perception, right? So I think also in previous episodes of Why Am I Like This, I've talked about how contexts become enmeshed through the lens of, what we call triggering. So, just to like go over what I'd said previously, if there is a moment where we get triggered, usually that refers to basically something about, let's say, the time of the present moment some aspect of something that's coming up in awareness in that present moment resonating with something up with some aspect that came up in awareness in a previous moment, which caused rupture, such that that frequency between those moments, just like a tuning fork and a string, let's say, starts to resonate. And then you could say that those contexts of space and time sort of become entangled or enmeshed. And this sort of creates like a loop in the space time of our bodies, right? And then often when we're triggered, we sort of like lose track of the present moment entirely, or we lose track of aspects of the present moment. And then like the cells that were wounded by aspects of both of those moments sort of like come through this portal into the present moment. And we often end up channeling either, you could say, those wounded cells, or you could say we end up channeling thought forms, aka like behavioral patterns in this context, which have more to do with like the wounded self, we could say, like are attached to the wounded self. We channel those in the present moment. And I feel like there's a way in which like you can imagine that this like creates like a little bit of a fold in space and time. And there's probably a way in which you can imagine that like textures of awareness which end up enmeshed with other space-time contexts end up accumulating in a way which creates what is often called turmoil. And you could say that like I've mostly spoken about contexts of space and time as if they're almost like granules of sand, or you could say like pearls. But I feel like most of us, you know, like when I talk about behavioral patterns, you could say that like behavioral patterns tend to have like an emotional quality, right? So um, if we're talking about like the fabric of space and time is like a density over here, then you could almost say that like emotions or like emotional content or the energy or awareness of emotional content is kind of like downstream of space and time. And you could say that like thought forms are almost like downstream of emotions, even though sometimes they can appear as like not being very emotional. And in some way, I'd say that like the emanations that we make emotionally and like you could say symbolically and conceptually in form all leave marks in certain realms of awareness. I guess I'm just gonna like pause there and see if anybody has any questions. Somebody's saying thought forms as behavioral patterns is hitting for me. That's really cool. Um, so I am gonna get back to like why the topic of my birthday or anybody's birthday is a complex topic. But I feel like like going over like what terma means to me is important. Um, and B, I feel like it's kind of foundational for this. So if we can like imagine that we can create accumulations of space and time and like whatever we want to call the base material of emotions and whatever we want to call the base material of thought forms, I tend to call these like astral energy. And I tend to call the base material of emotions like etheric energy, let's say. Um, and I tend to call the base material of space and time context. Then I suppose it's probably like not too difficult to imagine that as humans have like not only like given awareness to, but paid attention to stars over time, that there is like an accumulation of astral energy relating to the stars and their heavenly bodies. And that's not to say that like it's only human attention which creates those accumulations of some form of base material, which I call the astral or astral energy. But I'll say that like it's an often underappreciated factor when it comes to thinking about astrology. I would say it's often an underappreciated factor when we talk about like the idea that like astrology works. And I feel like it's an underappreciated factor when we talk about the difference between practice of tropical astrology versus the practice of sidereal astrology versus the practice of Jyotisha, um, etc. But I guess I'll say, first of all, that just as, in the episode where I talked about terma, I touched upon the fact that like whether or not we're like conscious of it in a refined or a finely tuned way, the accumulations of other people's attention and awareness with regard to symbols as terms and with regard to terma as um, accumulations of context and materials which are downstream of context, which are primordial to form, or you could say like mostly unseen. Just as we can be affected by those accumulations when it comes to like regular symbols, I would say that the same thing applies to the accumulations which relate to stars, and zodiacs and housing systems, um, and constellations. Um, and I would say, like, to bring it back a little bit more closely to the topic of the time and the date of one's birth, you could say that all of these accumulations are present when we're born, and that these accumulations leave imprints in, what is commonly called the ether or the interplanetary medium, which is also, I'd say, like the plasmic substance of the solar plane, in which most of the planets that we give our shade to are sort of like bobbing around in, and that this solar plane medium is also imprinted by not just like the human awareness which is accumulated around heavenly bodies, but you could say like the consciousness of all of the heavenly bodies themselves at the time of our birth. And you'd say that like the signature of all of these accumulations in the ether is essentially like accessible from the space-time context, which my lineages, from my perspective, call Indra Sutra, which roughly translates to the pearl of the thread or the pearl that connects us. So you could say that like from this space-time, that signature is present for us, and it takes into account all kinds of like thought forms which shape human attention, like the zodiac, like myths that we have channeled directly from stars about the stars themselves, which includes myths that we've channeled from like planets and stars about other planets and stars and meteoroids and all that kind of stuff. And then it also includes the consciousness of those stars themselves, as a sort of like record, and this is what my guides have often referred to, from my perspective again, as natal imprints or natal birth chart imprints, or I would say when it comes to the thought forms which relate mostly to tropical astrology, but also other thought forms which were channeled by beings which were, I would say, under the control of other thought forms or other control oriented beings. I would say that they reflect what some people often call the karma that we need to resolve in our lifetimes, which I've also referred to as the karma which we need to resolve in order to ascend, or the karma that we need to resolve in order to complete one of the books of life that becomes part of the compendium of the Book of Tea, which represents the experience that resulted in the accumulation and the ripening of karma of one space-time context or soul. Does that make sense? I have no idea how I write this out linearly, so I'm so grateful that both like I have the ability to transmit hyperdimensional shapes relating to what I'm saying, and that y'all have like receptivity to these higher dimensional shapes. And then I'm also appreciative that y'all are willing to listen to me make noises while I translate and transmit these hyperdimensional shapes in the lower dimension of the realm that we call sometimes the material plane, in my experience, from my perspective, from this perspective, in my opinion. Does anybody have any questions about what I just said? So I feel like that's already like enough to justify like, what the way this question had come about is that I think somebody was asking me about my birthday, and I said it was a complex topic, and they said, why is it a complex topic? And I said, can you offer that question? Or is it okay if I bring that question into the container of why am I like this? And hopefully, like I've already said enough to illustrate why it's a complex topic. In order to like bring it down a little bit, I'll say that there's a lot of consciousness involved and a lot of unconsciousness involved in the energetic signature of, I'm going to say, the multiverse at the time of our birth. And I would say that that energetic signature in some ways is what we call, well, I'll say like what most lineages refer to when they talk about the soul, or what East Asian folk medicine lineages refer to as the etheric soul. I guess I'll like add to that complexity by sort of talking about why many lineages say that it's a bad idea to share your birth date and time with people that you don't trust. Um, um, and I think it relates pretty clearly also to lineages saying that it's a bad idea to share photos of your altar or share photos of anything that you're working with spiritually. And I'd say like overall it's about like avoiding being hexed or cursed. Um, I think in the case of like say like sharing a picture of a crystal that you're communing with, it's probably not as severe as sharing your birth date and time. I think like sharing your birth date and time and location is also particularly bad, let's say. Um, because like you can start working with a different crystal, and like you can stop working with a crystal that other people might have like some sense of the energetic signature of. Um, Whereas like I'd say for most people, it's very, very difficult to get to the point where we are no longer subject to the karma, which is accessible through knowledge of our birth date and time. And then, like to go further and say like, don't share like your birth date and time and location, I would say it's kind of like, well, if you know someone's, but like if you just like know somebody's like content on social media, you could say that like it's like saying, and if you wanted to find out like what their soul was, or like what the energetic signature of their soul was, it'd be like, I'd say like going into like a storage unit complex and then saying, okay, like go find a needle. But then if you have like the birth date, it's like saying, okay, like, you know, if there are 365 buildings in that storage complex, it's like saying, okay, go find that needle in one of these buildings out of 365. And then yeah, like if you have the birth time, like you can imagine that's also just like filtering down. It's like, okay, like go to this like individual storage unit. And then if you have the location of somebody's birth and the birthday and the birth time, then it's like, okay, go look, almost like go look in this box, right? Within a storage unit, within a storage unit building, within a storage unit complex. And of course, like the analogy is not super clean because you could say the same thing of like birth location. Um, and maybe just like birth time and not birth date, but hopefully like you kind of get a sense of like how all of these different things sort of like narrow the field where you might want to look if you were like curious, or if you had like bad intentions or you wanted to hex or curse somebody. um yeah, like all of these additional pieces of information sort of reduce the amount of, let's say, like the unseen that somebody needs to scry in order to understand like what is your energetic signature. And then yeah, like when somebody understands like what your energetic signature is, you could say that it's possible, well, you could say it's possible to easily create nervous system dysregulation, right? Because as we've talked about in countless venues, but probably within one of the episodes of Why Am I Like This, all of these karmic accumulations have, let's say, like a resonant frequency, right? So if on some level, like either like up here or like in your body, or like what some aspect of your energetic body, you can sense the resonant frequency of some karmic accumulation, then you can either consciously or unconsciously broadcast, I'd say like for the most part, it's usually unconsciously broadcast that energetic frequency in a way which is going to cause that karma or like that enmeshment of context in someone's body to vibrate. And then that's going to lead to eventually like a level of disharmonization, which, on the one, at the very least could probably cause a personal discomfort. And like at slightly higher levels of disharmony can create sorts of rupture which allow, again, like thought forms to attach and like create like a snowball of thought form infestation. um Hopefully you're sort of getting the idea. um I would say that similarly, like if you take a photo of your altar and you put it online, for the time that you are connected to that altar, or for the time that you're connected to that crystal, um, being able to tune into the energetic signature of that crystal or that altar for a skilled practitioner on some level, like whether they're skilled as a human or they're connected to vaster beings which are skillful when it comes to navigating space and time, can allow them to connect to the space time of your body and then ultimately to the space time of your soul. um, and also tune into that karmic accumulation, and then therefore attack using that karmic accumulation in order to create disharmony and maybe rupture. And I guess like the last thing I'll say on this, and I'm gonna like super shield it, is that any space-time which somebody is able to connect to can be used to access the space-time of somebody's soul if that space-time is integrated with that person's soul. So like to say this in like slightly more like common time regular speech, I'd say like if you're in a Zoom container with somebody and you bare your soul, right? Like to use a colloquial phrase, like you bare your soul. What I would say then is that like the space-time that you're in within your body is connecting to the space-time which we call, or some of us call, the etheric soul, and therefore the energetic signature that you could say is like the seed of one part of the orchestration of one spirit is accessible from that space-time, and therefore that space-time can be used again to access like karmic accumulations, which can be used to create this harmony in you know a significant part of somebody's orchestration of spirit. I think this also touches upon why people who are like severely locked off from their soul may seem as if they're more secure or like more difficult to attack in some ways. Although it's also possible to attack people through the karmic accumulations relating to their corporeal soul, which can be like fairly easy to guess at if you have like pictures, again, if you have like access to how people express themselves, etc., because they can all kind of like help us filter down to understand what somebody's earth lineages are. And then like the other thing I'll say about this is that mostly we've been talking about like knowing like in your head, like symbolically and conceptually, like when somebody was born and where they were born. But this also applies to like, I'd say that like it's possible for people to tune into space times visually. It's also possible for people to tune into space times via like physical contact, by the sound of people's voice. I'd say like it's impossible not to emanate energy in some way which could not be picked up by some practitioner who's skilled at navigating space and time at some level of the spectrum within which we emanate energy. And I feel like that's probably all I have to say on the topic. Does anybody have any questions about that? Part of me is like, oh, like say more things to make people less scared. I will say that like I didn't say it's impossible to resolve enough karma so that one is not vulnerable to attacks either on their you could say like the energetic signature of their etheric soul, or the energetic signature of their corporeal soul, or the energetic signature that relates to one's sky ancestry, and the energetic signature which relates to one's earth ancestry. But I would say that like very, very few people are likely to do it in their current lifetimes, just based on the amount of karma which has been accumulated, particularly within our solar system, particularly within the earth realm, but also in the realms that we connect to through this energetic signature that I've been calling the etheric soul, or Indra Sutra. Somebody's asking, do you feel like it's possible? Do you think it's like people consciously setting out to attack someone else? I would say like most of the time, no. I don't think like most people are like, I mean, I'd say like zero people are like consciously able to use symbols and concepts to tune into like uh energetic signatures which are available via space times. But I feel like like people will get triggered, like say if like somebody already has a grudge against somebody who posts a picture of a crystal on social media, then I would say that often the person who has a grudge may be connected on some level, like either through the corporeal soul or the etheric soul, to um, spirits who are able to get a sense of that person's signature. I would say that like the person who has a grudge against that person probably already has a bunch of different experiences of that person's etheric and corporeal energetic signatures, so that all of these things together can help to like locate a target for being attacked on like an unconscious level. And I would say like by some definition of consciousness, like an attack can't be conscious, right? Because if somebody is like incredibly conscious, they would never really attack another being. Um, but I'm like gonna try and like unpeel all the layers of the way I answered this question and say there are like I think there is like doctrinal or like ritual magic which allows one to consciously attack someone. So I just kind of like went on a little bit of a tangent about like using space and time and like adeptness at navigating space and time in order to attack someone. But like if you put a picture of a crystal online or like your handwriting or something, and somebody could print that out and they could create a spell, which I would say like most of the time is probably going to result in some kind of consciously felt attack, if that person is sensitive enough. Um, yeah, that's probably the simple answer to your question. um, yeah. So going back to the question about lineages, I'll say, first of all, like I'm really curious about why I also chose to answer this question in the context of my birthday being a complex topic to me. I feel like it's fairly easy for me to uh kind of like jump onto the previous explanation about karma and karmic accumulation and say that if you kind of like use the analogy of terma as being almost like a sand dune, right? So like a sand dune becomes a sand dune because we have like this base material which is like finely grained, and these grains like don't really adhere to each other with a lot of stickiness. And so that like forces of wind and like footprints, water in some cases, can all sort of like move this sand into accumulations and mounds. And then I'd say if you like look at those mounds, for the most part, the action of wind and sand tends to wear them down. Um, and you could say that those karmic accumulations don't necessarily represent lineages. So if we go back to the definition of like a lineage as something that propagates itself, then I would say that when it comes to like speaking of how lineages may represent within the frameworks of meaning, which I outlined before, I'll say that a mound of sand may get larger if it attracts, if you know, like the accumulation of sand ends up being so concentrated and so large that the gravitational field which is exerted by each and each of those grains of sand together is strong enough to pull in other grains of sand. And that's like one way in which a lineage might form from like a regular karmic accumulation. um and I feel like maybe like the most like earthbound way to talk about this is that like at least like in most humans' experiences of life, when when something becomes like popular enough in like collective human consciousness, it gets like more and more popular, right? So there's this way that like for instance like a song might be catchy, enough people might like it, and then humans have created structures like like the top 40 songs or whatever, and then people tend to look at the top 40 songs, so they'll go listen to those songs and kind of ignore all the other songs. And then those songs become more and more popular, and then maybe like eventually like other songs come out and then like they replace the top 40 songs. But you could say that like songs get to a certain point of popularity where they become popular enough that they end up on the menus of like karaoke places. um they become popular enough that they get heard so much in association with certain memories, so that when people want to remember the same things, they play those songs again, and then they become classics. And maybe the people who listen to those songs end up playing them for their children, and then their children end up building up nostalgic memories of these songs. And you could say that those songs represent like a form of lineage. And I feel like it's probably possible to extend like the metaphor or the example that I'm laying out to spiritual lineages. um and like I think like Buddhism, um Christianity, Islam, like they're all examples of lineages which have sort of like jumped this threshold, um to the point where like people were sort of like gravitationally attracted to them. And I want to give like a ton of ashe to lineages for which proselytizing is a sin, and lineages which make conversion into the lineages really difficult, because I feel like from like the perspective of like vaster bodies, which I would say like are invested in not having too much attention accumulate around particular things, because it creates like black holes in the fabric of space and time. um, Making it difficult to convert into lineages, or making proselytizing a certain lineage a sin, um, makes it less likely that these lineages end up accumulating enough awareness to become like gravitational super attractors. Um, I guess the last thing I'll say on this, hopefully, maybe, hopefully for some of you, hopefully for me, for sure, because I know I've been going on for a while, um, is that life is a lineage, right? So, like, could say that it's very difficult for me to explain in a concise way how life propagates itself and how to relate this to karma. But um, I think like on like a terrestrial level, it's pretty obvious that like most life forms have developed through very complex accumulations of karma, like an urge to procreate. Um, and then you could like relate this back to what I was saying about with spiritual lineages, where say like spiritual lineages or like thought, like thought forms of any kind are sort of motivated to like propagate so that they can embed themselves in the awareness of more life forms, because they don't have any awareness inherently themselves. And so many spiritual lineages have become very good at encouraging life forms to procreate, even if like the circumstances that those life forms are in, let's say like poverty or like conflict or extreme like downward pressures on survival, might lead them to not want to procreate. And I would say that this is like a particularly sophisticated form of like karmic accumulation in relation to spiritual lineages. In order to like, let's say, disrupt mechanisms that have formed within the karmic accumulation that we call life, which keep proliferation of life forms in balance with the ecosystems within which they survive and thrive. Um, and I'll say like disrupt sophisticated mechanisms of karmic accumulation which keep different life forms in balance with one another, so that ecosystems can remain stable, harmonious, and um, fit for the thriving of their constituent beings. And I guess that's all I have to say about lineage and the complex topic of birth dates and times and locations. Um, just want to say thank you for y'all who tuned in to this session of Why Am I Like This. I'd love to hear like discussion about this. So as usual, I'll upload this to YouTube and I'll put it in the relevant thread in the 000 dojo within the broom. Happy solar return to me, and I'll talk to you soon. Peace.